Hello, weary traveler, wherever you find yourself tonight. Perhaps you're nestled beneath warm blankets in a comfortable bed, the glow of your phone or tablet casting soft shadows across your face. Maybe you're listening from a cozy chair by a window, watching the last light of day fade into gentle darkness. Or perhaps you found yourself in that liminal space between wakefulness and dreams, seeking the kind of story that will carry you softly into sleep. What time is it where you are? Is it that perfect hour when the world begins to quiet, when the demands of the day finally release their grip on your shoulders? Take a moment to settle in, to let your breathing slow, to feel the weight of your body against whatever surface supports you. Tonight, we're going to journey together to a time when such simple comforts, a warm bed, a full belly, the promise of tomorrow's meal, were luxuries beyond the reach of most human souls. If you find solace in these midnight wanderings through history's forgotten corners, I invite you to return again. There are so many stories waiting to be told, so many voices from the past that deserve to be heard before sleep takes us. But for now, let us focus on this one tale, this exploration of what it meant to hunger in an age when hunger was humanity's most faithful companion. Tonight, we're going to discover why food in medieval times was not just scarce, it was often a source of suffering so profound that it shaped the very architecture of human civilization. We'll walk together through kitchens where smoke stung eyes already dimmed by malnutrition, where every grain of wheat was precious as gold, where the difference between life and death could be measured in a handful of barley or a cup of thin gruel. So close your eyes if you wish, or let them rest softly on these words. Allow yourself to drift backward through the centuries, past the abundance that surrounds us now, past the grocery stores and restaurants and midnight snacks, back to a time when the human relationship with food was defined not by choice, but by desperate necessity. The story we're about to explore is not a comfortable one. It's a tale of empty bellies and moldy bread, of children who went to sleep hungry more nights than not, of entire communities that lived perpetually on the knife's edge between sustenance and starvation. But within this darkness, we'll also find something profoundly human, the incredible resilience of people who found ways to survive, to create meaning, to maintain dignity even when their bodies were failing them. Are you ready to step into that world? To feel the gnawing ache of true hunger, to understand what it meant when food was not fuel for living, but the very substance of survival itself? Then let us begin our journey into the medieval world, where every meal was a small miracle, and every empty bowl was a reminder of mortality's constant presence. The wind is picking up outside, isn't it? You can almost hear it beginning to howl through those ancient streets we're about to explore together. Why food in medieval times was pure, unrelenting miseria, daily torment that consumed every waking thought and haunted every restless sleep. Imagine, if you will, that tomorrow morning you wake up and every grocery store has vanished, every restaurant, every fast food chain, every convenience store, gone. The refrigerator in your kitchen stands empty, and there is no way to fill it. The pantry shelves are bare, and there will be no delivery trucks coming to restock them. This is not a temporary inconvenience, not a brief power outage or supply chain disruption. This is your new reality, and it will last not for days or weeks, but for the rest of your life. Now multiply that anxiety by 1,000, because you also know that there is no safety net waiting to catch you. No government assistance, no charitable organizations with modern infrastructure, no emergency services standing by to help. You are entirely dependent on what you can grow, hunt, gather, or trade with your own hands, and you must do this with medieval tools, medieval knowledge, and in a medieval world where crop failure means death, where a harsh winter can wipe out entire villages, where the very concept of enough food is a luxury reserved for the tiny fraction of humanity lucky enough to be born into nobility. This was the reality for our ancestors, but it was even worse than this thought experiment suggests, because they also lived in bodies weakened by lifelong malnutrition in a world without modern medicine, where a simple infection could become fatal, where broken bones might never heal properly, where dental problems could make eating excruciating even when food was available. The medieval relationship with food was not about pleasure, not about choice, not about culture or cuisine in any sense that we would recognize. It was about survival in its most elemental form, the constant, grinding awareness that death by starvation was always lurking just beyond the next failed harvest, the next harsh winter, the next outbreak of disease that would kill the animals and destroy the crops. For the vast majority of medieval people, perhaps 90% of the population, food was always scarce, always uncertain, always of such poor quality that eating it was often as dangerous as not eating at all. They consumed bread made from grain so old and moldy that it caused hallucinations and convulsions. They ate meat so spoiled that it required massive amounts of salt and spices just to mask the taste of decay. They drank water so contaminated that ale and wine, weak as they were, became the safer choice for daily hydration. And yet, somehow, incredibly, they endured. They developed elaborate systems for preserving what little food they could produce. They learned to find nourishment in things we would never consider edible. They created communities bound together by the shared knowledge that individual survival was impossible, but only by working together, sharing resources, and supporting the weakest among them could any of them hope to see another spring. The brutality of medieval hunger was not just physical, though the physical suffering was immense. It was psychological, spiritual, existential. It meant that every decision was filtered through the lens of survival. Should we eat the seed grain now, knowing that it means no crop next year? Should we slaughter the breeding animals to get through this winter, knowing that it means no livestock next summer? Should we give the last of the food to the children, the adults, or the elderly who have the wisdom to help the community survive? These were not abstract moral questions debated by philosophers in comfortable halls. These were daily realities faced by people whose bodies were already weakened by years of inadequate nutrition, whose immune systems were compromised by constant stress, whose very ability to think clearly was impaired by the metabolic effects of chronic hunger. The medieval world was not a romantic place of noble knights and fair maidens. It was a world where food was so precious that it shaped every aspect of society, where wars were fought over grain stores, where marriages were arranged to secure access to farmland, where entire social hierarchies were built around who had the right to eat first when resources were scarce. So, as we prepare to explore this world together, to understand what it really meant to be hungry in an age of perpetual scarcity, let yourself feel grateful for the simple fact that you do not have to worry about where your next meal will come from. Let yourself appreciate the miracle of abundance that surrounds us, even as we journey back to a time when such abundance was literally unimaginable. The hunger is beginning to gnaw at your belly now, isn't it? Even thinking about it, you can almost feel that hollow, aching emptiness that was the constant companion of our medieval ancestors. You wake before dawn in a one-room cottage that smells of smoke, unwashed bodies, and something indefinably sour, the smell of poverty, of too many people living too close together with too little of everything. The air is thick and grey, filled with the acrid smoke from a fire that burns not clean wood, but whatever can be found: dried dung, rotting thatch, scraps of cloth to warm to serve any other purpose. Your eyes water and sting, but you've grown so accustomed to this that you barely notice anymore. The first sensation that hits you, even before full consciousness returns, is the gnawing ache in your stomach. It's not the sharp, demanding hunger of someone who has simply missed a meal or two. This is something deeper, more persistent, hollow, grinding emptiness that has been your constant companion for so long that you can barely remember what it feels like to truly be full. Your body has adapted to this state, slowing your metabolism, making you feel perpetually cold and weak, but never quite allowing you to forget that you are slowly starving. You share this single room with your family, perhaps a spouse, several children, an aging parent or two. Everyone sleeps on straw mattresses that have grown thin and lumpy with use, covered by rough woolen blankets that provide warmth but little comfort. The blankets smell of lanolin and dirt, and they scratch against skin that has grown rough and dry from poor nutrition and constant exposure to cold. Outside, you can hear the first stirrings of the village coming to life. A rooster crows, but it sounds weak and thin like you. It has not been eating well. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the creak of a cartwheel and the soft thud of hooves on dirt. But these sounds are muffled by the fog that seems to perpetually hang over the village, a combination of morning mist and the smoke from dozens of poorly ventilated fires. You sit up slowly, careful not to move too quickly. Rapid movements make you dizzy now, a side effect of the chronic low blood pressure that comes with malnutrition. Your joints ached not just from sleeping on a thin mattress, but from the constant inflammation that accompanies a diet lacking in proper nutrients. Your teeth feel loose in your gums, and there's a metallic taste in your mouth that never quite goes away. The fire in the center of the room has burned down to embers during the night, and the cottage is bitterly cold. You can see your breath, and you know that the water in the wooden bucket by the door has probably formed a thin skin of ice. But there's no time to tend to comfort. The first priority, always, is to assess what food might be available for today. You look toward the corner where your family keeps what passes for a larder, few wooden shelves, a couple of clay pots, some baskets woven from reeds. Even in the dim light, you can see that the supplies are running dangerously low. There's perhaps a handful of barley left in one of the pots, some turnips that have started to soften and sprout, a piece of cheese so hard and aged that it will need to be soaked in warm water before it can be eaten. Your spouse stirs beside you, and you see the same awareness cross their face, that moment of waking when the reality of another hungry. Day settles in like a weight on the chest. There are no words exchanged. There's nothing that needs to be said. You both know exactly how much food is left, exactly how many mouths need to be fed, exactly how many days must pass before there might be any possibility of more. The children are still sleeping, curled together for warmth under a shared blanket. They look smaller than they should, their faces gaunt, their hair thin and brittle. The youngest has been crying more than usual lately, not the demanding cry of a well-fed child, but the weak, exhausted whimper of someone whose body is beginning to shut down non-essential functions to conserve energy. You stand up, moving carefully to avoid the loose floorboard that squeaks and might wake the children before it's absolutely necessary. Every extra minute of sleep is a gift while they sleep. They're not conscious of the hunger, not asking for food that doesn't exist, not looking at you with those trusting eyes that expect you to somehow provide what you don't have. The bucket of water by the door has indeed formed ice, and you have to break through it with your knuckles to get to the liquid beneath. The water is cloudy and has a strange taste. It comes from the village well, which is little more than a hole in the ground that collects whatever runoff can be found. You've learned not to think too hard about what might be in it. Clean water is another luxury that belongs to a different world. You splash some of this questionable water on your face, and the cold makes you gasp. Your reflection in the water shows a face that has aged far beyond its year's skin that's sallow and dry. Eyes that have sunk deep into their sockets, cheekbones that stand out too prominently. If you saw a photograph of yourself from our modern perspective, you would immediately recognize the signs of severe malnutrition. But this is not unusual. This is not a medical emergency that requires intervention. This is simply what most people look like in your world, the walking wounded of chronic hunger. Bodies that continue to function despite being perpetually deprived of what they need to thrive. As you prepare to face another day of managing impossible scarcity, you can already feel your mind beginning to calculate and recalculate the same equations that occupy your thoughts from morning until night. How much food is left? How can it be stretched? Who needs it most? What can be found, gathered, earned, or traded to supplement what you have? How many days until the next possible influx of resources? These calculations are not abstract mathematics. They are the difference between life and death. And everyone in your household, even the children, knows exactly how the numbers add up. The sun is beginning to rise, casting pale light through the single small window of your cottage. It's time to begin another day of surviving in a world where food is not sustenance or pleasure, but the single most precious and elusive resource in existence. To understand why medieval food was such a source of misery, we must first understand the world that created this misery, a world built entirely around the brutal mathematics of agricultural survival, where every aspect of human civilization was shaped by the constant threat of starvation. Picture Europe in the year 900, or 1100, or 1300. The specific century matters less than the underlying reality that remained constant for hundreds of years. This is a world that has forgotten the agricultural innovations of Rome. A world where most of the technological knowledge that might have made farming more efficient has been lost to war, plague, and the collapse of educational systems. What remains is a patchwork of small communities, each one desperately trying to coax enough food from the soil to keep its people alive until the next harvest. The basic unit of this world is the manor self-contained agricultural community that might include anywhere from a few dozen to a few hundred people, all of them dependent on the productivity of the land immediately around them. There are no global supply chains, no refrigerated transport, no way to move large quantities of food over long distances without spoilage. If the land around your manor cannot produce enough food to feed everyone who lives there, then people will starve, and there is very little that can be done about it. This geographic isolation creates a kind of agricultural roulette wheel. Some years, your region might receive adequate rainfall at the right times, avoid devastating storms, escape the worst of the insect plagues, and produce something close to a decent harvest. Other years, and these are frequent drought, flood, hail, locusts, plant diseases, or simple bad luck will destroy most or all of the crops, condemning the entire community to months of slow starvation. The tools available for farming are primitive beyond modern comprehension. The plough, when it exists at all, is often little more than a pointed stick reinforced with metal. Many farmers still work the soil with hand tools, hoes, spades, sickles that require enormous amounts of human labor to produce even small yields. A single family might spend months of back-breaking work to produce enough grain to last them through the winter, assuming nothing goes wrong. But things go wrong constantly. The weather is unpredictable and often hostile. Plant diseases can wipe out entire fields in a matter of days. Insects can strip crops bare. Animals, both wild and domestic, can destroy months of work in a single night. And even if the crops survive to harvest, the primitive methods of storage mean that much of what is produced will rot, spoil, or be consumed by rats and mice before it can be eaten. The social structure of medieval society reflects this agricultural reality. At the top of the hierarchy is the lord of the manor, who owns the land and has the right to take a portion of everything that is produced on it. Below him are various levels of peasants and serfs, who work the land in exchange for the right to live on it and keep a portion of what they produce. At the bottom are the landless laborers, who survive by working for others and hoping that their labor will be rewarded with enough food to keep them alive. This system is not designed for efficiency or fairness. It is designed for survival in a world where agricultural productivity is so low that there is barely enough food to go around even in good years. The Lord takes his share first, not because he is greedy, though he may be, but because the social stability of the entire community depends on maintaining the hierarchy that organizes agricultural production. If the Lord cannot maintain his position, the entire system of land management and resource allocation collapses, and everyone starves. The peasants who actually work the land live in a state of perpetual indebtedness to both the Lord and to the land itself. They owe labor to the Lord, typically several days per week, working on his personal fields rather than their own. They owe him a portion of their harvest, paid in grain, livestock, or other goods. They owe him fees for using his mill to grind their grain, his oven to bake their bread, his roads to transport their goods. But even more fundamentally, they owe their lives to the productivity of the soil. And the soil is a harsh creditor that demands payment in constant labor while offering no guarantees of return. A peasant family might work from dawn to dusk every day of the growing season, only to see their crops destroyed by a single violent storm. They might carefully save seed grain through a hungry winter, only to plant it in soil that has been depleted by years of intensive cultivation without adequate fertilization. The fertilization problem is particularly acute because it reflects the closed-loop nature of medieval agriculture. The only fertilizers available are animal manure and human waste. But the animals are often too valuable to slaughter for meat, and both animals and humans are frequently undernourished, producing waste that is less rich in nutrients than it would be in a better-fed population. The soil gradually becomes depleted, yields decline, and the spiral of scarcity tightens year by year. Crop rotation, which could help maintain soil fertility, is poorly understood and difficult to implement when every available acre must be planted just to meet immediate survival needs. Letting fields lie fallow is a luxury that requires having enough productive land to afford leaving some of it unused. Luxury that most communities simply cannot afford. The result is an agricultural system that operates at the very margins of viability, where small variations in weather or other conditions can push entire communities over the edge into famine. And famine, in the medieval world, does not mean temporary inconvenience or government food aid. It means slow, agonizing death for anyone who cannot find alternatives, and there are very few alternatives available. Trade can sometimes help, but medieval trade networks are limited, expensive, and unreliable. Moving food over long distances requires pack animals or carts that are slow, vulnerable to robbery, and expensive to maintain. Even when food is available in distant markets, most people lack the money to buy it, and the merchants who control the trade have little incentive to serve markets where customers cannot afford to pay. The church, which is the only institution with resources that span multiple communities, does what it can to provide relief during famines. But the church's resources are also limited, and its first priority is often to maintain its own institutions rather than to feed the hungry. Monastery granaries might provide some relief during the worst famines, but they cannot solve the underlying problem of agricultural inadequacy. As you lie in your medieval cottage, listening to your family's breathing in the darkness, you understand all of this instinctively, even if you lack the vocabulary to describe it in economic or historical terms. You know that your survival depends on a complex web of relationships with the land, with the weather, with the Lord who owns your home, with the neighbors who might help you in times of crisis or compete with you for scarce resources. You know that every decision you make must be weighed against its potential impact on this delicate balance. Every grain of wheat consumed today is grain that will not be available tomorrow. Every day spent tending your own small plot is a day not spent earning wages that might buy additional food. Every child born into your family is another mouth to feed from resources that are already stretched beyond their limits. This is the architecture of scarcity, a world built around the fundamental reality that there is never enough, where every institution, every relationship, every daily routine is shaped by the constant presence of hunger and the ever-present possibility of starvation. And within this architecture, you must somehow find ways to not just survive, but to maintain your humanity, to care for your family, to find meaning and dignity in a life that offers very little margin for error and almost no room for hope. What passed for food in the medieval world would horrify anyone with modern sensibilities about nutrition, hygiene, or basic food safety. But when starvation is the alternative, people learn to eat things that would make them rich in times of plenty, and to be grateful for the opportunity to do so. Let us walk together through a typical medieval kitchen. If the dark, smoky corner of a one-room cottage can be dignified with such a term. Here, suspended from the low ceiling, hang pieces of meat that have been preserved through methods that rely more on hope than science. The meat is often several months old, blackened on the outside, covered with a layer of salt that has crusted into something resembling concrete. Flies buzz around it constantly, laying eggs that hatch into maggots. But the maggots are often removed and the meat consumed anyway, because protein of any kind is too precious to waste. The preservation process itself is a study in desperation disguised as technique. Without refrigeration, without proper understanding of bacterial contamination, without reliable access to high-quality salt, medieval people developed preservation methods that were as likely to create toxic food as to preserve it safely. Meat was often smoked over fires that burned whatever fuel was available, including animal dung, rotting wood, and household waste, imparting flavors and chemical compounds that would be considered dangerous by modern standards. Salt, when it could be obtained, was often impure, contaminated with dirt, sand, and various minerals that added their own unpleasant flavors and potentially harmful effects. The salt used for preservation might be the same salt used for tanning hides, cleaning, or other non-food purposes, carrying with it traces of chemicals and contaminants that would accumulate in the body over time. But even properly salted meat presented its own challenges. The salt curing process, when it worked, created food that was so intensely salty it was almost inedible. Before cooking, preserved meat had to be soaked in water for hours or even days to remove enough salt to make it palatable. But this soaking process often took place in the same contaminated water that was used for drinking, washing, and waste disposal. The bread that formed the foundation of most medieval diets was often a grotesque parody of what we think of as bread today. In times of scarcity, which is to say, most of the time grain was stretched with whatever else could be found. Sawdust, ground tree bark, crushed nuts and shells, dried and powdered roots, Even clay and sand were mixed into flour to increase its bulk and make it last longer. The grain itself was often of terrible quality. Harvested grain was stored in conditions that promoted mold, insect infestation, and bacterial growth. Medieval people lacked effective methods for drying grain or protecting it from moisture. So much of the grain supply was at least partially rotted by the time it was ground into flour. The grinding process took place in mills that were rarely cleaned, using millstones that often shed grit and stone particles into the flour. Ergot poisoning was a constant threat. This fungal infection of rye and other grains produces powerful, psychoactive, and toxic compounds that cause hallucinations, convulsions, gangrene, and death. Medieval people called it holy fire or St. Anthony's fire, and entire communities would sometimes be affected simultaneously, leading to mass outbreaks of what appeared to be demonic possession or divine visitation, but was actually collective poisoning from contaminated bread. Even when the grain was relatively clean, the bread-making process introduced its own hazards. Yeast was poorly understood and often contaminated with harmful bacteria. The ovens used for baking were frequently shared among multiple families and were rarely properly cleaned. Bread was often baked on surfaces that had been used for other purposes, picking up flavors and contaminants from previous uses. The vegetables that supplemented this grim diet were often in equally poor condition. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips were stored in root cellars that frequently flooded, allowing the vegetables to rot partially while still being consumed. Preserved vegetables were pickled in brines that might contain dangerous levels of contamination, or dried using methods that left them vulnerable to insect infestation and mold. Cabbage, one of the few vegetables that could be preserved effectively through fermentation, often became so sour and strong-tasting that it was barely edible, but it was consumed anyway because it provided essential nutrients that were otherwise unavailable during the winter months. The fermentation process itself was hit or miss, sometimes producing beneficial bacteria that improved digestion, but often creating harmful toxins that caused stomach problems and other health issues. Dairy products presented their own set of problems. Milk could not be preserved fresh for more than a few hours without refrigeration, so it was typically consumed only by families that owned cows or goats, and even then only during the animals' lactation periods. Most milk was processed into cheese or butter, but the lack of proper sanitation meant that these dairy products were often contaminated with harmful bacteria. The cheese-making process took place in environments that would be considered shockingly unsanitary by modern standards. Milk was often collected in containers that had been used for other purposes and were cleaned, if at all, with the same contaminated water used for everything else. The cultures used for cheese-making were passed down from batch to batch without any understanding of bacterial contamination, sometimes carrying dangerous pathogens along with the beneficial cultures needed for fermentation. Butter, when it could be made, was preserved by packing it in salt or storing it in cool places that were often contaminated with insects, rodents, and other pests. Rancid butter was common, but it was still consumed because fat of any kind was too valuable to waste, even when it had spoiled to the point of causing digestive distress. The water that accompanied these meals was perhaps the most dangerous element of all. Medieval communities typically got their water from wells, streams, or rivers that were contaminated with human and animal waste. Agricultural runoff and industrial waste from activities like tanning and metalworking. The concept of water purification was essentially unknown, and the same water sources were used for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and waste disposal. Beer and wine, weak as they were, became the primary beverages not because medieval people were constantly drunk, but because the fermentation process killed some of the harmful bacteria in contaminated water. Even children drank weak beer as their primary beverage because it was safer than water, though the alcohol content meant that mild intoxication was a constant state for much of the population. The spices that were used to mask the flavors of spoiled and contaminated food were often as dangerous as the food itself. Many medieval spices were actually toxic plants that were used because they had strong flavors, not because they were safe to consume. Lead and other heavy metals were sometimes used as food additives, either intentionally as preservatives or accidentally through contamination from cooking vessels and storage containers. Cooking methods introduced additional hazards. Food was typically cooked over open fires that burned whatever fuel was available, often producing toxic smoke that contaminated the food. Cooking vessels were made from materials that could leach harmful compounds into food, lead-glazed pottery. Unlined copper pots, containers made from materials that had been used for non-food purposes. The entire process of food preparation took place in environments that were contaminated with animal waste, human waste, insects, rodents, and various forms of decay. The same surfaces were used for food preparation, animal slaughter, waste disposal, and other activities, with little or no cleaning between uses. Yet this was not exceptional. This was normal. This was what food looked like for the vast majority of human beings who lived during the medieval period. They developed strong stomachs out of necessity, immune systems that were constantly fighting off infections, and a tolerance for flavors and textures that would be absolutely revolting to modern palates. And still, despite all of this, despite the contamination and spoilage and contamination, there was often not enough even of this poor quality food to go around. Families would fight over moldy crusts of bread, carefully divide portions of rancid meat, and supplement their diets with things that barely qualified as food at poultry bark, grass, leather boiled until it became soft enough to chew. The miracle is not that medieval people often got sick from their food, or that many of them died from malnutrition and foodborne illnesses. The miracle is that any of them survived at all, that they found ways to extract enough nutrition from this grotesque banquet of survival to keep their bodies functioning, to raise children, to maintain communities, to pass on the knowledge and skills that would eventually lead to better ways of living. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the taste of that bread on your tongue, gritty, sour, with the underlying bitterness of ergot and the musty flavor of mold. Imagine chewing meat so tough and salty that your jaw aches, washing it down with water that tastes of decay, and hoping that your stomach will be strong enough to keep it down. This was not a failure of civilization. This was civilization doing the best it could with the knowledge and resources available, fighting every day against the fundamental hostility of a world that seemed designed to starve its human inhabitants. Time itself becomes an enemy when food is scarce, because each season brings its own particular form of suffering, its own specific relationship with hunger, its own cruel lessons about the fragility of human survival in a world that offers no guarantees. Spring arrives not as a season of renewal and hope, but as the cruelest months of all the time medieval people called the Hunger Gap, when the previous year's stored food has dwindled to almost nothing, but the new crops are still months away from harvest. This is when families discover whether they calculated correctly during the autumn, whether they saved enough grain to last through the winter, whether their preservation techniques worked well enough to keep their food supply from spoiling completely. You wake on an April morning to find that the family's grain supply has been reduced to perhaps a week's worth of thin gruel, stretched with water and whatever edible plants can be foraged from the still frozen ground. The stored turnips have begun to sprout and rot, filling the cottage with the sweet, cloying smell of decay. The preserved meat has developed a greenish tinge that everyone pretends not to notice, because there is no alternative protein available. This is the season when children stop growing, when their bodies begin to consume their own muscle tissue to stay alive. Their bellies swell with the fluid retention that accompanies severe malnutrition, creating the paradoxical appearance of being both starved and bloated. Their hair loses its color and becomes thin and brittle. Their teeth begin to loosen in their gums, and small cuts take weeks to heal. Adults fare no better. The physical labor required for farming becomes increasingly difficult as bodies weakened by months of inadequate nutrition struggle to perform the work necessary to plant the crops that might if the weather cooperates. If the insects don't come, if disease doesn't provide food for the following winter, it is a cruel irony that the hardest physical work of the year must be performed when people are at their weakest and most vulnerable. The psychological effects of spring hunger are perhaps worse than the physical ones. This is the season when hope becomes a form of torture. Because everyone knows that relief is theoretically possible, the new crops are growing in the fields. The days are getting longer. The weather is warming. But all of these positive changes remain tantalizingly out of reach for months that feel like years. Families begin to make the terrible calculations that define survival in a world of absolute scarcity. Which children are most likely to survive until harvest? Which adults are most essential for the community's long-term survival? How much of the seed grain can be consumed as food before it becomes impossible to plant an adequate crop for next year? These are not abstract moral dilemmas discussed in philosophy classes. These are daily realities faced by people whose bodies are shutting down, whose thinking has become clouded by malnutrition, whose emotional resources have been depleted by months of constant stress. Parents look at their children and realize they may have to choose which ones to feed. Communities look at their elderly and disabled members and wonder whether keeping them alive is worth the resources it requires. Summer brings its own forms of suffering, different but no less intense. The new crops are growing, but they are not yet ready to harvest, and the spring hunger gap has left everyone weak and vulnerable. This is the season of back-breaking agricultural labor performed by people who are barely functional, of long days in the fields under a sun that beats down mercilessly on bodies that have no reserves of fat or muscle to protect them. The early summer crop speas, early vegetables, whatever can be harvested before the main grain crops are ready, provide some relief. But these foods are often consumed so eagerly by starving people that they cause digestive problems. Stomachs that have shrunk during months of inadequate food cannot handle sudden increases in consumption, leading to cramping, diarrhea, and other problems that further weaken already compromised bodies. This is also the season when foodborne illnesses are most common, because the warm weather promotes bacterial growth in food supplies that are already marginal in quality. The same heat that is essential for growing crops also accelerates the spoilage of whatever preserved food remains from the previous year, creating a race between harvest and complete spoilage of existing supplies. Work in the fields becomes a form of slow torture. People who are severely malnourished must spend 12 to 14 hours a day performing intensive physical labor under conditions that would challenge healthy, well-fed workers. They must harvest grain with hand tools, thresh it by beating it with flails, winnow it by tossing it in baskets to separate the grain from the chaff, all while their bodies are consuming their own tissues to provide the energy for this essential work. Autumn is supposed to be the season of relief, the time when the harvest finally provides the food that has been hoped for and worked toward through months of suffering. But even harvest time brings its own terrors, because this is when the year's survival is finally calculated with brutal precision. Will there be enough food to last through the coming winter? Have the preservation techniques worked well enough to keep the food from spoiling before it can be consumed? How much must be given to the Lord? How much must be saved for seed? How much can actually be eaten? The harvest itself is a race against time and weather. Grain must be cut and gathered quickly, before storms can destroy it, before it can over-ripen and fall to the ground, before insects or animals can consume what represents the difference between life and death for the entire community. People work 18-hour days during harvest time, cutting grain with sickles that blister their hands, carrying heavy bundles that strain backs already weakened by malnutrition, racing against the possibility that everything they have worked for all year might be lost in the final moments. Even a successful harvest brings anxiety rather than celebration, because now comes the terrible arithmetic of survival. The Lord's share must be calculated and set aside, typically a third or more of the total harvest. The seed grain for next year's planting must be preserved, no matter how hungry people are today. The portion that must be ground into flour, the portion that can be traded for other necessities, the portion that might, if everyone is very careful, very lucky last until next year's harvest. Families spread their grain on floors, counting and recounting, trying to make the numbers work, trying to find a way to make insufficient food stretch through the long months ahead. Children watch their parents perform these calculations with expressions of terrible understanding, because even small children in the medieval world know exactly what it means when the numbers don't add up. Winter, when it finally arrives, transforms hunger from an acute crisis into a chronic condition that defines every aspect of daily life. This is the season when families huddle together in dark cottages, burning whatever fuel they can find, trying to conserve body heat because their weakened metabolisms cannot generate warmth efficiently. The cold becomes an additional enemy, forcing bodies that are already struggling to survive to expend precious calories just maintaining basic functions. The preserved food that seemed adequate in October begins to show its limitations by December. Stored grain develops infestations of insects and rodents that consume substantial portions of the supply. Preserved vegetables begin to rot in their storage containers. Salt meat becomes so desiccated and hard that it must be soaked for days before it can be chewed, and even then provides more salt than nutrition. This is the season when people learn to eat things that barely qualify as food. Tree bark is stripped, dried, and ground into a powder that can be mixed with flour to extend the bread supply. Leather item shoes, belts, scraps of clothing are boiled into gelatinous soups that provide some protein and calories, even if they are almost impossible to digest. Grass, when it can be found under the snow, is gathered and cooked into broths that provide bulk, if not nutrition. The psychological effects of winter hunger are particularly devastating because this is the season when hope becomes almost impossible to maintain. Spring seems infinitely far away, the next harvest an abstract possibility that might as well be on another planet. People begin to understand, in their bones, what it means to slowly starve the way the body consumes itself, the way thinking becomes clouded and slow, the way emotions flatten into a kind of grey exhaustion that makes everything seem pointless. Yet somehow, incredibly, many people do survive these winters. They develop survival techniques that seem almost superhuman from our modern perspective. They learn to slow their metabolisms through extended periods of near-complete rest. They discover which wild plants can provide minimal nutrition during the coldest months. They create social networks that ensure the most vulnerable members of the community receive whatever food is available, even when this means that others must go without. Communities develop elaborate systems for sharing resources during the worst periods of winter scarcity. Families take turns providing thin soups for communal meals, stretching their individual supplies by pooling them with others. Elderly people, who require fewer calories to maintain their smaller body masses, sometimes voluntarily reduce their own food consumption to ensure that children and working adults receive adequate nutrition. The seasonal cycle of hunger creates a psychological landscape that is difficult for modern people to understand. Medieval people lived their entire lives with the knowledge that abundance was temporary, that every period of adequate nutrition was simply preparation for the next period of scarcity. They could never relax, never take food for granted, never assume that tomorrow's meal would be available without careful planning and constant work. This seasonal rhythm of want shaped every aspect of medieval culture. Religious observances were timed to correspond with periods of scarcity and abundance. Festivals and celebrations were concentrated in the autumn months, when food was most available. The concept of fasting, which modern people often view as a spiritual discipline, was simply a formalization of conditions that existed naturally throughout much of the year. The social hierarchies that defined medieval society were built around these seasonal realities. The Lord's power derived not from abstract authority, but from his control over the resources that meant survival during the worst months. The peasants' obligations were not arbitrary impositions, but acknowledgments of their dependence on systems that made survival possible, even if barely so. As winter deepens around your medieval cottage, as the wind howls through gaps in the walls and the fire burns lower each night, you understand that time itself has become a form of torture. Each day that passes brings you closer to spring and the possibility of new food, but it also consumes more of your dwindling reserves, weakens your body further, makes it less likely that you will have the strength to last until relief arrives. You count the days, but you also count the remaining handfuls of grain, the pieces of preserved meat, the wrinkled turnips that represent your family's chances of survival. You make calculations and bargains with a future that offers no guarantees, hoping that your arithmetic is correct, that your preservation techniques have worked, that the winter will not be longer or harsher than usual. And through it all, you maintain the routines and relationships that make survival possible, the sharing of resources, the care for the most vulnerable, the preservation of knowledge and skills that will be essential when spring finally does arrive. You endure because endurance is the only choice, because giving up means not just your own death, but the death of everyone who depends on you. The seasons turn cruel and indifferent, but somehow life continues. Somehow people find ways to extract meaning and dignity from circumstances that seem designed to crush the human spirit. The cycle of want continues, but so does the cycle of survival, adaptation, and the stubborn refusal to surrender to despair. In the depths of winter, when the stored grain has dwindled to dust and the preserved meat has been consumed down to moldy scraps, when the cold seeps through every crack in the cottage walls and hunger becomes a living thing that gnaws constantly at your belly, you begin to see the faces that famine wears, the specific ways that starvation transforms the people you love into hollow-eyed strangers, each carrying their own particular burden of suffering. There is young Margot, the miller's daughter, who was once known throughout the village for her quick wit and bright laughter. You remember her from the autumn harvest, when she danced at the brief celebration that followed the gathering of the grain, her cheeks flushed with health and her eyes bright with the temporary joy that comes from knowing the community had survived another year. Now, in the depths of February, she moves like an old woman, her steps careful and deliberate, her hands trembling as she carries water from the well. Margot has developed the peculiar beauty that sometimes accompanies starvation. Her face has become ethereal, almost translucent, with cheekbones that stand out like carved marble and eyes that seem enormous in her thinned face. But this beauty is the beauty of consumption, of a body that is slowly devouring itself to stay alive. Her hair, once thick and dark, has become sparse and brittle, and she has developed the habit of wrapping her arms around herself constantly, as if trying to hold her shrinking body together through sheer will. She no longer speaks much, having learned that conversation requires energy that must be conserved for more essential activities. When she does speak, her voice has become soft and breathy, lacking the force that comes from well-nourished lungs. She has begun to walk with the peculiar gait of the chronically hungrier shuffling step that conserves energy, avoids sudden movements that might cause dizziness, keeps the center of gravity low to prevent falls that weakened bones might not survive. Then there is old Willem, the village's most experienced farmer, whose knowledge of soil and weather and plant diseases has kept the community alive through multiple cycles of scarcity. Willem has lived through famines before, and his body shows the accumulated damage of decades of periodic starvation. His spine has curved from years of bending over inadequate food. His joints have swollen from the chronic inflammation that accompanies malnutrition. His teeth have long since fallen out, requiring him to soften every bit of food in warm water before he can consume it. Willem's eyes have taken on the peculiar quality of someone who has seen too much suffering, too much death, too many winters when the arithmetic of survival simply didn't work out in favor of human life. He moves through the village like a living repository of terrible knowledge, understanding better than anyone else exactly how precarious everyone's situation really is. He knows which families are closest to complete starvation, which children are unlikely to survive until spring, which stores of grain are already exhausted despite their owners' attempts to hide their desperation. But Willem also carries the burden of practical decisions that no one else wants to make. He is the one who calculates whether the community's seed grain should be consumed as food, knowing that eating it means no crop next year, but also knowing that many people will die before next year if they don't eat it now. He is the one who decides which animals should be slaughtered for meat and which should be kept alive for breeding, which families should receive larger shares of the remaining food and which should be asked to survive on less. These decisions weigh on Willem in ways that are visible in his posture, his expression, the way he sometimes stops in the middle of conversations and stares off into the distance as if calculating probabilities that are too terrible to speak aloud. He has become a kind of priest of scarcity, performing the brutal mathematics of survival while carrying the psychological burden of knowing that his calculations often mean the difference between life and death for people he has known since they were children. In the cottage next to yours lives Beatrice, a young mother with 3 small children and a husband who died of fever just before the winter began. Beatrice represents one of the most vulnerable categories in medieval society, a woman without a man's labor and protection, trying to keep children alive on resources that were barely adequate when her family was complete. She has aged years in the few months since her husband's death, her face taking on the gaunt, desperate look of someone who is fighting a battle she knows she cannot win. Beatrice's children are slowly starving before her eyes, and she is powerless to prevent it. The oldest, a boy of perhaps 8 years, has developed the swollen belly and stick-thin limbs that are the classic signs of severe malnutrition. He no longer plays with the other children, lacking the energy for games. Instead, sitting quietly in corners with the peculiar stillness that comes when the body begins shutting down non-essential functions to conserve energy for basic survival. The middle child, a girl of 5 or 6, has stopped growing entirely. Her clothes, which fit her properly in the autumn, now hang loosely on a frame that seems to be shrinking rather than developing. She has developed the habit of staring at food with an intensity that is disturbing to observe, not the normal hunger of a child, but the desperate fixation of someone whose body is consuming itself. The youngest, still nursing, presents Beatrice with the most impossible choice of all. Beatrice's own malnutrition means that her breast milk is barely adequate, thin and insufficient to properly nourish a growing infant. But weaning the child would mean finding alternative food sources that simply don't exist, condemning the baby to certain death. So Beatrice continues to nurse, feeling her own body growing weaker as it tries to produce milk from resources that have long since been exhausted, knowing that she is slowly killing herself to buy the child a few more weeks of life. Beatrice has become hollow-eyed and skeletal, her body having consumed all of its fat reserves and begun working on muscle tissue. Her hands shake constantly, and she has developed the slow and careful movements of someone who understands that a fall or injury could be fatal. When the body lacks the resources for healing, she speaks to her children in whispers, partly to conserve energy, but also because she lacks the emotional strength for normal parental interactions. The psychological burden of watching her children slowly die while being unable to help them has begun to break Beatrice's mind. She sometimes speaks to her dead husband as if he was still present, asking him what she should do, apologizing for her failure to keep their children alive. She has begun to neglect her own appearance and hygiene, no longer bothering with the small rituals of self-care that normally help people maintain their sense of human dignity. These individual faces of famine multiply throughout the village, each family dealing with its own particular version of slow starvation, each person finding their own way to cope with circumstances that would challenge the strongest and healthiest human beings. There is the blacksmith, whose powerful body has wasted away until he can barely lift the tools of his trade. There is the baker's wife, who has developed the peculiar psychological condition that sometimes accompanies severe hunger and obsession with food that manifests as constant talk about elaborate meals, detailed descriptions of feasts that exist only in her imagination. There are the children who have stopped attending the informal school that the village priest sometimes conducts, not because education has become unimportant, but because walking to the church requires energy that must be saved for more essential activities. There are the elderly people who have quietly begun giving their food shares to younger family members, understanding that their own deaths are inevitable, but hoping to buy time for those who might survive until spring. The village priest, Father Benedict, presents perhaps the most complex face of famine, because his religious obligations require him to maintain hope and provide spiritual comfort even when physical comfort is impossible. Father Benedict's own body shows the effects of months of inadequate nutrition. His robes hang loosely on a frame that has shrunk dramatically. His face has taken on the gaunt appearance that is becoming universal in the village. His hands tremble when he raises them in blessing. But Father Benedict also carries the additional burden of trying to make theological sense of suffering that seems to serve no purpose, of trying to explain to his parishioners why a loving God would allow innocent children to starve slowly to death. He struggles with his own faith as he performs last rites for people who are dying, not from disease or accident, but from the simple absence of food in a world that seems designed to withhold the basic necessities of life. The priest's sermons have become shorter and more focused on the promise of eternal reward, because discussions of earthly justice or divine providence ring hollow when delivered to a congregation that is slowly dying of hunger. He has begun to focus more on practical aid sharing the church's limited food supplies, organizing community efforts to support the most vulnerable families, providing what physical comfort he can when spiritual comfort seems inadequate. Father Benedict's own spiritual crisis is visible in the way he sometimes pauses during prayers, as if searching for words that might make sense of circumstances that challenge every assumption about divine benevolence. He has begun to spend long hours alone in the church, presumably in prayer, but perhaps simply because solitude is easier than facing the questions he cannot answer, the hope he cannot honestly provide. As you observe these faces of famine around you, you begin to understand that starvation is not simply a physical process, but a complete transformation of human society. People who were once confident and capable become hesitant and fearful. Relationships that were once based on affection and mutual support become transactions calculated around scarce resources. Communities that once gathered for celebration and social interaction become collections of isolated individuals, each focused entirely on the impossible challenge of keeping themselves and their families alive. Yet even in the midst of this transformation, traces of humanity persist. People still share what little they have with those who have even less. Parents still sing quietly to their children, even when their voices are weak and their songs are interrupted by coughing. Neighbors still check on each other, still offer what comfort they can, still maintain the social bonds that make survival possible even under the most impossible circumstances. The faces of famine are not just masks of suffering, but testimonies to the incredible resilience of human beings who refuse to surrender their humanity even when their bodies are failing, who continue to care for each other even when caring requires sacrifices they can barely afford to make. Even in the depths of winter's cruelest hunger, when death seems to lurk in every shadow and hope feels like a luxury too expensive to afford. There are moments, brief, fragile, but precious beyond measure, when humanity asserts itself against the darkness, when small acts of kindness create tiny islands of warmth in an ocean of suffering. It happens on a February morning when the wind has been howling for 3 days straight, driving snow through every crack in the cottage walls, when the fire has burned down to almost nothing because fuel has become too precious to waste. You wake to discover that someone you never learn who has left a small bundle outside your door. Inside the rough cloth wrapping, you find perhaps a day's worth of barley, a piece of salted meat no larger than your thumb, and most precious of all, a small clay pot containing what appears to be honey. The honey is old, crystallized, probably saved from the previous summer's brief abundance, but it represents something far more valuable than its caloric content. Someone in your community, someone who is also hungry, also struggling to keep their own family alive, has chosen to share this treasure with you. They have calculated their own family's needs, measured their own children's hunger, and decided that they can afford to give away this small portion of sweetness. You taste the honey slowly, letting each crystal dissolve on your tongue, and for a moment the grinding ache in your stomach recedes, replaced by something approaching pleasure. It's been months since you've tasted anything sweet, and the honey connects you briefly to memories of better times, of summer afternoons when the bees were working and the world seemed capable of providing abundance rather than perpetual scarcity. But more than the physical nourishment, the honey represents proof that generosity can survive even the most desperate circumstances, that people who have every reason to hoard what little they possess can still find ways to care for their neighbors. The anonymous gift becomes a small flame of hope in the darkness, evidence that community bonds remain stronger than individual desperation. These moments of unexpected kindness appear throughout the village like tiny miracles. Old Willem, despite his own family's needs, has quietly begun sharing his knowledge of which wild plants might provide minimal nutrition during the winter months. He leads small groups of women and children into the frozen forest, teaching them to recognize the inner bark of certain trees that can be ground into flour, the roots that remain edible even under snow, the techniques for preparing foods that would otherwise be inedible or even dangerous. Willem's teaching represents a form of generosity that extends beyond immediate material aid. He is sharing the accumulated wisdom of decades of survival, knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death for people who might otherwise lack the skills to find alternative food sources. His willingness to invest energy in teaching, when energy is the most precious resource available, demonstrates a kind of faith in the future that is remarkable given the circumstances. The village women have organized themselves into informal networks of mutual support that operate below the level of official community organization. They take turns checking on the most vulnerable families, sharing responsibility for caring for children whose parents are too weakened by hunger to provide adequate supervision. They pool their knowledge of food preservation, cooking techniques, and home remedies, creating a collective wisdom that helps everyone survive more effectively. These women's networks represent one of the most important survival mechanisms in medieval communities, though they often operate invisibly without formal recognition or official authority. Women share their breast milk when nursing mothers become too malnourished to feed their infants adequately. They take turns sitting with sick children, providing care that exhausted parents cannot manage alone. They organize the collection and distribution of whatever wild foods can be gathered, ensuring that knowledge and resources are shared rather than hoarded. The children, despite their own suffering, sometimes create moments of joy that seem almost miraculous given the circumstances. A group of the village's youngest children has developed a game that involves building tiny houses from twigs and scraps of cloth, creating imaginary worlds where their toy families have adequate food and warm fires. The game requires almost no energy to play, but it provides a mental escape from the constant awareness of hunger and cold. Watching these children play, their movements slow and careful, but their imaginations still active, provides the adults with something approaching hope. The children's ability to create fantasy worlds where suffering doesn't exist reminds everyone that human creativity and resilience can survive even the most devastating circumstances. Their quiet voices, discussing the elaborate feasts their toy families will enjoy, become a kind of prayer for better times that might someday come. Father Benedict has begun holding informal evening gatherings in the church. Not formal religious services, but simple opportunities for people to sit together in a space that is marginally warmer than their individual cottages. These gatherings rarely involve much conversation. People lack the energy for extended social interaction, but the simple act of being together, of sharing the warmth of collective body heat, provides comfort that goes beyond the physical. During these evening gatherings, someone might quietly begin humming a familiar song, and others will join in, their voices weak but harmonious. The songs are usually simple folk tunes, melodies that everyone knows, words that speak of seasons changing, of love persisting through hardship, of communities enduring together. The singing requires minimal energy, but creates a sense of shared experience that helps people remember they are not suffering alone. Sometimes, during these gatherings, people share stories, not elaborate tales, but simple memories of better times, descriptions of meals they remember from previous years, plans for what they will do when spring finally arrives. These stories become a form of collective dreaming, a way of imagining futures that might be possible if everyone can just survive a few more months. The blacksmith, despite his own weakened condition, has continued to maintain the community's essential tools, refusing payment for his work even though he desperately needs the food that payment might bring. He understands that working plows and grain processing equipment will be essential when spring planting begins, and that maintaining these tools now is an investment in everyone's future survival. His workshop has become an unofficial gathering place for men who need work to occupy their minds during the long, hungry hours of winter days. They help with simple tasks that require more hands than skill, creating an atmosphere of shared purpose that helps combat the psychological effects of enforced inactivity. The work is slow and often interrupted by the need to rest, but it maintains social connections that might otherwise be lost to the isolating effects of individual survival struggles. Even the community's relationship with food itself occasionally provides moments of grace that transcend mere survival. When families gather for their meager evening meals, they sometimes maintain rituals of gratitude and sharing that transform starvation rations into something approaching communion. A father might carefully divide a piece of bread into equal portions for his children, treating each small piece with the reverence normally reserved for sacred objects. These meal rituals serve multiple purposes beyond simple food distribution. They maintain family bonds during times when everyone is focused primarily on individual survival. They teach children that sharing and gratitude remain important values even when resources are desperately scarce. They create moments of structured time when families can acknowledge their shared struggle and mutual dependence. The physical act of eating together, even when the food is inadequate, becomes a form of resistance against the dehumanizing effects of chronic hunger. By maintaining the social customs associated with meals, families assert their commitment to remaining civilized, to preserving the cultural practices that distinguish human communities from mere survival groups. Perhaps most remarkably, some people have found ways to maintain hope through small acts of preparation for better times that may never come. A woman might carefully preserve a few flower seeds from the previous summer, protecting them through the winter with the same care she devotes to preserving food, planning for a spring garden that will provide beauty rather than nutrition. A man might spend precious daylight hours carving a small toy for his child, investing time and energy in creating something that serves no survival function but demonstrates faith in a future where play and beauty might again be possible. These acts of hope require tremendous courage in circumstances where hope seems like a dangerous luxury. They represent choices to invest resources in possibilities rather than certainties, to believe that life might again include experiences beyond mere survival. They are small rebellions against despair, quiet assertions that human beings are more than just biological machines designed for survival. As you drift toward sleep in your cold cottage, listening to the wind outside and the quiet breathing of your family around you, you carry these small mercies with you like treasures hoarded against the darkness. The taste of honey still lingers faintly on your tongue. The memory of voices singing together in the church provides a counterpoint to the wind's harsh song. The knowledge that your neighbors have not entirely forgotten how to be generous offers protection against the despair that threatens to consume everything. These moments do not solve the fundamental problem of scarcity that defines your world. They do not fill empty bellies or warm frozen cottages or guarantee that anyone will survive until spring. But they provide something almost as essential as food or warmth, evidence that humanity can endure even the most devastating circumstances. The community bonds can survive even the most extreme individual needs. That hope can persist even when hope seems foolish and dangerous. In a world where survival often seems to require abandoning everything that makes life worth living, These small mercies remind you that the choice to remain human is still possible, still worthwhile, still worth the energy it requires to maintain dignity and compassion in the face of circumstances that seem designed to destroy both. As the winter nights grow longer and the cold seeps deeper into your bones, as hunger becomes not just a sensation but a way of being that shapes every thought and every dream, you begin to understand that the suffering you are experiencing is not unique to your generation, not an aberration in the normal flow of human experience, but part of an ancient pattern that has been repeating itself for countless centuries, will continue repeating itself for centuries to come. Your grandmother, if she lived long enough for you to know her, carried in her bent body and clouded eyes the memory of famines that preceded your birth. Winters when the death toll was so high that entire families simply disappeared from the village, leaving empty cottages that gradually collapsed back into the earth from which they came. She could tell you, if you asked, and if she had the strength to remember, about the great famine of her youth, when people resorted to eating tree bark and leather, when the roads were lined with the bodies of those who had left their homes searching for food that existed nowhere. Her grandmother, in turn, had lived through famines that made even that catastrophe seem mild by comparison. Seasons when entire regions were depopulated, when the survivors were so weakened that they could not plant crops even when the weather improved, creating cycles of scarcity that lasted for years rather than months. Each generation carries these memories in their bodies, in the way they hoard even the smallest scraps of food, in the way they never quite trust that abundance, when it comes, will last. The stories passed down through generations create a kind of cultural memory of hunger that shapes behavior even during times of relative plenty. People who have survived famines never entirely lose the habits of scarcity, the careful calculation of resources, the reluctance to waste even the smallest amounts of food, the tendency to save rather than consume, to prepare always for the next catastrophe that experience suggests is inevitable. Children who grow up during famines carry the physical and psychological marks of malnutrition for the rest of their lives, even if they later experience periods of adequate nutrition. Their growth is permanently stunted, their immune systems permanently compromised, their relationship with food permanently marked by the anxiety of someone who has learned that meals are never guaranteed. They become adults who cannot quite believe in security, who hoard resources even when hoarding seems unnecessary, who view every sign of scarcity as confirmation that the terrible times are returning. This intergenerational transmission of trauma creates communities that are shaped as much by the memory of past famines as by current conditions. Social customs, religious practices, economic systems, even architectural choices reflect the accumulated wisdom of people who have learned to expect the worst and plan accordingly. The thick walls of granaries, the elaborate preservation techniques, the social hierarchies that prioritize resource distribution, all of these represent adaptations to a world where starvation is always a possibility. The cultural memory of hunger also shapes the community's relationship with abundance when it occasionally occurs. Harvest festivals are not just celebrations of current prosperity, but desperate attempts to store up joy against the lean times that everyone knows are coming. The feasting that accompanies weddings and religious holidays represents not just happiness, but a kind of defiant assertion that life can include pleasure even in a world defined primarily by suffering. These celebrations take on an almost sacred quality, because everyone present understands how precious and temporary such moments are. The ability to eat until satisfied, to share food freely, to give children extra portions without calculating the cost. These experiences become treasured memories that must last through the long months of scarcity that will inevitably follow. The psychological impact of living with this kind of cultural memory is profound and often invisible to those who experience it. People develop a baseline level of anxiety about survival that never entirely disappears, even during good times. They become hypervigilant about signs of potential scarcity, interpreting minor variations in weather or crop yields as possible harbingers of catastrophe. They struggle to enjoy present abundance because past experience has taught them that abundance is always temporary and often followed by periods of extreme deprivation. This chronic anxiety about survival shapes personality in ways that persist across generations. People become cautious, conservative, reluctant to take risks that might jeopardize their family's security. They develop strong community bonds because individual survival is clearly impossible. But they also maintain a kind of emotional distance that protects them from the devastating grief that comes with losing people they love to starvation and disease. The religious implications of living with perpetual scarcity are equally profound. Medieval Christianity developed elaborate theological explanations for suffering that make sense primarily in the context of communities where suffering is the normal state of human existence. The emphasis on patience, endurance, acceptance of divine will, and hope for heavenly reward reflects the spiritual needs of people who must find meaning in circumstances that seem designed to crush the human spirit. Prayer becomes not just spiritual practice, but practical psychology, a way of maintaining hope when hope seems irrational, of finding purpose in suffering that serves no apparent earthly function, of maintaining social bonds when individual resources are too scarce to support normal social interactions. The promise of eternal abundance provides comfort to people whose earthly experience suggests that abundance of any kind is impossible. The saints venerated in medieval communities often reflect this reality of chronic scarcity. They are figures who achieved holiness through voluntary poverty, who found spiritual meaning in material deprivation, who demonstrated that human dignity could survive even the most devastating physical circumstances. Their stories provide models for how to maintain humanity in the face of dehumanizing conditions, how to find grace in suffering that seems to serve no purpose. But perhaps most remarkably, this cultural memory of hunger also preserves and transmits knowledge that enables survival under impossible circumstances. The techniques for finding edible plants during winter, the methods for preserving food without refrigeration, the social systems that ensure resource sharing during emergencies, all of this represents accumulated wisdom that has been tested repeatedly under conditions where failure means death. Each generation refines and passes on this survival knowledge, adding new techniques discovered through trial and error, preserving information about which strategies work and which ones fail catastrophically. The grandmother who teaches her grandchildren to recognize edible roots is transmitting information that could literally save their lives. Knowledge that has been purchased through centuries of human suffering and experimentation. This intergenerational transmission of survival skills creates a kind of collective intelligence that enables communities to endure conditions that would be impossible for individuals to survive alone. The knowledge of how to organize resource sharing, how to identify the most vulnerable community members, how to maintain morale during extended periods of deprivation, all of this represents cultural adaptation to environmental challenges that exceed the capacity of individual humans to overcome through personal effort alone. As you lie in the darkness of your medieval cottage, surrounded by the quiet breathing of family members whose survival depends on decisions you cannot control and resources you do not possess, you become part of this ancient chain of human endurance. Your experience of hunger, your techniques for coping with scarcity, your methods of maintaining hope in apparently hopeless circumstances. Of this will be remembered and passed on, becoming part of the cultural memory that helps future generations survive their own encounters with famine and deprivation. The knowledge that you are not the first to endure these circumstances, and sadly not the last, provides a strange kind of comfort. Your suffering is not meaningless because it is not unique, connects you to countless others who have faced the same challenges, who have found ways to preserve their humanity under conditions that seem designed to destroy it. In this great chain of human endurance, your small acts of kindness, your moments of hope, your refusal to surrender to despair become part of a larger story of survival that spans centuries and will continue, long after your individual story has ended. The strength you find to continue living, to care for others, to maintain dignity in the face of degradation, all of this contributes to the collective human project of surviving in a world that often seems hostile to human life. The long shadow of memory connects you not just to the past, but to the future. 2 generations not yet born who will face their own versions of these challenges and who will need the wisdom that you are helping to preserve and transmit. Your endurance has meaning not just for your immediate survival, but for the continuation of human community across time. And so, dear traveler, as we reach the end of our journey through this landscape of hunger and hardship, as the grey light of dawn begins to filter through the cracks in our imagined medieval cottage, we find ourselves faced with a profound paradox. We have spent these hours together exploring one of the darkest chapters in human history, examining suffering so complete and systematic that it challenges our ability to comprehend how our ancestors managed to survive at all. Yet somehow, in witnessing their struggle, we have also witnessed something extraordinary: the incredible capacity of human beings to endure, to adapt, to maintain their essential humanity even under conditions that seem designed to destroy everything that makes life worth living. The people we have walked among tonight, the starving peasants, the desperate mothers, the village priests struggling to maintain faith in the face of senseless suffering, these were not fundamentally different from us. They possessed the same capacity for love, the same need for purpose and meaning, the same desire to protect their children and care for their communities. What made their lives so different from ours was not any deficiency in their character or intelligence, but simply the accident of being born into a world that had not yet learned how to produce and distribute food efficiently enough to prevent mass starvation. Their suffering was not noble or beautiful or spiritually elevating in any way that would make it worth preserving or recreating. It was simply suffering grinding, daily, often pointless suffering that served no higher purpose except to demonstrate the terrible fragility of human existence when it is not supported by adequate resources and social systems. The fact that people endured it, found ways to maintain dignity and compassion within it, created meaning despite it, does not make the suffering itself valuable, but their endurance that has value that extends far beyond their historical moment. Every technique they developed for preserving food, every social custom they created for sharing scarce resources, every method they discovered for maintaining hope during apparently hopeless circumstances, has contributed to the accumulated human knowledge that eventually made possible the world we inhabit today. The abundance that surrounds us now, the grocery stores filled with food from around the world, the restaurants offering cuisines our ancestors could never have imagined, the simple fact that most of us go to sleep each night confident that tomorrow will bring breakfast. All of this is built on the foundation of knowledge preserved and transmitted by people who never experienced such abundance themselves. The agricultural techniques that enable modern food production, the transportation systems that move food efficiently across vast distances, the preservation methods that prevent spoilage, the social institutions that organize distribution. All of these represent the culmination of centuries of human learning, much of it purchased through the kind of suffering we have witnessed tonight. When you wake tomorrow morning and open your refrigerator, when you turn on the tap and clean water flows freely, when you make choices about what to eat based on preference rather than availability, you are benefiting directly from the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who lived and died in circumstances we can barely imagine. The medieval peasant who learned through trial and error which wild plants could provide nutrition during winter famines. The village elder who developed techniques for storing grain that would last until the next harvest. The community leader who organized resource sharing that kept the most vulnerable members alive during the worst times. All of these people contributed to the knowledge base that eventually made possible the food security that we now take for granted. This continuity across time suggests something profound about human nature that transcends the specific historical circumstances we have explored tonight. Despite the variations in technology, social organization, and material conditions, human beings have consistently demonstrated the same fundamental commitment to survival, not just as individuals, but as communities. The same impulses that drove medieval peasants to share their last handful of grain with starving neighbors continue to motivate people today who work to address hunger and poverty in our own time. The techniques may have changed. We now have industrial agriculture instead of subsistence farming, global supply chains instead of local food production, government safety nets instead of church charity. But the underlying human commitment to ensuring that everyone has enough to eat remains remarkably consistent across centuries. The food banks and soup kitchens that serve hungry people in modern cities operate according to the same basic principles of community mutual aid that enabled medieval villages to survive their worst famines. This continuity also suggests that the abundance we enjoy today, while dramatically greater than anything our ancestors could have imagined, remains fragile in ways that we often forget. The systems that provide us with food security are complex, interdependent, and vulnerable to disruption in ways that medieval people would recognize immediately. Climate change, supply chain disruptions, economic instability, political conflicts, all of these can threaten food security in ways that echo the challenges our ancestors faced, albeit on different scales and with different solutions available. The medieval experience of hunger reminds us that food security is not a problem that has been permanently solved, but an ongoing human challenge that requires constant attention, investment, and social cooperation. The fact that we have largely eliminated famine in much of the world represents one of humanity's greatest achievements, but it is an achievement that must be actively maintained rather than taken for granted. Perhaps most importantly, our journey through medieval hunger tonight offers us a profound lesson in gratitude. Not the shallow gratitude that comes from comparing our lives to those of people who suffered more than we do, but the deeper gratitude that comes from understanding how many people contributed to making our lives possible. Every meal we eat connects us to farmers and transportation workers and food processors and grocery store employees, to scientists who developed better agricultural techniques, and engineers who designed better preservation methods, to all the people who work to maintain the complex systems that ensure food remains available and affordable. But our gratitude should extend even further back in time, to all the people who lived and died during the centuries when hunger was humanity's constant companion, whose suffering and endurance and gradual accumulation of knowledge eventually made possible the abundance we enjoy today. The medieval peasant who carefully saved seed grain through a starving winter, knowing that this sacrifice might mean the difference between life and death for future generations, was contributing directly to the food security that protects us now. This historical perspective also offers us guidance for how to think about our responsibilities to future generations. Just as we have inherited the benefits of our ancestors' suffering and wisdom, we have obligations to pass on to our descendants a world where hunger and scarcity are even more fully eliminated than they are today. The choices we make about how to organize food production and distribution, how to address climate change and environmental degradation, how to ensure that economic systems serve human needs rather than abstract profit. All of these will determine whether future generations inherit a world of greater abundance or are forced to rediscover the survival techniques that our medieval ancestors knew too well. The story we have shared tonight is ultimately a story about human resilience, about the incredible capacity of people to endure circumstances that should crush the human spirit, to maintain compassion and dignity even when their own survival is in doubt, to pass on knowledge and values that serve future generations even when they themselves receive no benefit from this transmission. This resilience is not unique to medieval people. It is a fundamental characteristic of human nature that manifests wherever people face extreme challenges. The same qualities that enabled medieval communities to survive repeated famines, the willingness to share resources, the commitment to protecting the most vulnerable, the ability to find meaning and hope even in desperate circumstances, continue to emerge wherever people face poverty, displacement, natural disasters, or other forms of extreme hardship. Recognizing this continuity in human nature should inspire both humility and hope. Humility, because it reminds us that the comfort and security we enjoy today are not the result of our own superiority, but gifts that we have inherited from people who endured suffering we can barely comprehend. Hope, because it demonstrates that human beings possess remarkable capacity to survive, adapt, and create meaning even under the most challenging circumstances. As our long night's journey together draws to a close, as you prepare to return from this medieval world of hunger and scarcity to your own world of abundance and choice, carry with you not just the knowledge of how difficult life once was, but also the awareness of how much strength and wisdom and compassion human beings are capable of displaying when circumstances require it. Remember the anonymous person who left honey outside a starving family's door, the village women who organized mutual aid networks that kept the most vulnerable members of their community alive, the elderly people who quietly gave their food shares to children and younger adults, the priest who maintained hope and provided comfort even when his own faith was challenged by senseless suffering. These people, living in circumstances that would challenge anyone's capacity for generosity and kindness, chose again and again to act in ways that affirmed the value of human life and human community. Their choices, multiplied across countless communities and generations, eventually created the foundation for the more humane world we inhabit today. Their example suggests that we too possess the capacity to make choices that will benefit people we will never meet, that will contribute to creating a future where suffering is reduced and human potential is more fully realized. The abundance we enjoy today is not an endpoint, but a platform from which we can work to ensure that future generations inherit an even better world. So sleep well, dear traveler, secure in the knowledge that you are part of this great human story of survival and adaptation and gradual progress toward a more just and abundant world. Rest in the comfort of your warm bed, grateful for the meal you ate today and confident in the meal you will eat tomorrow. but also aware that these simple securities are precious gifts that connect you to countless others across time and space. Dream of medieval cottages, if you will, of smoky fires and thin gruel and the wind howling through gaps in ancient walls. But dream also of the strength and kindness that enabled people to survive in those cottages, of the knowledge and wisdom they preserved and transmitted, of the hope they maintained even when hope seemed foolish and dangerous. And when you wake in the morning to abundance that medieval people could never have imagined, remember that this abundance carries with it the responsibility to ensure that the story of human survival and adaptation continues, that the long arc of history continues to bend toward greater justice and security for all people. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the darkness of medieval hunger. Thank you for witnessing the suffering of people who lived centuries ago, but whose struggles helped create the world we share today. Thank you for your attention to their stories, your compassion for their circumstances, your willingness to learn from their example. May your dreams be peaceful, your rest be deep, and your awakening be filled with gratitude for all the people, living and dead, who have contributed to making your life possible. Until we meet again in these midnight wanderings through history's forgotten corners, sleep well, and remember that you are part of something much larger and more meaningful than any individual life, the ongoing human project of survival, adaptation, and the creation of meaning in the face of an often indifferent universe. The dawn is breaking now, soft and grey, bringing with it the promise of another day in a world where hunger, while not entirely eliminated, no longer dominates human existence as it once did. Rest now in that promise, and in the knowledge that your own small acts of kindness and generosity continue the ancient human tradition of caring for one another, even when caring requires sacrifice. Sweet dreams, weary traveler, sweet dreams.